I woke up on a Tuesday morning in late April to find my garden had come back from the dead, but not in the way anyone would expect. My name is Oscar Vaughn, and I had been living in the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision in Raleigh, North Carolina for 3 years. The house was perfect, the neighborhood was decent, and everything seemed fine until Patricia Henderson became the HOA president 18 months ago. Patricia was one of those women who seemed to have been born clutching a rulebook in one hand and a complaint form in the other. She was 52, wore her blonde hair in that helmet-like style that never moved, and had a voice that could cut through steel when she was telling you about some made-up violation. But I am getting ahead of myself. This story really started back in December when I first noticed something was wrong. I had spent the entire previous autumn preparing my garden for winter. It was not just any garden either. I had put 3 years of work into creating raised beds with custom soil mixes, installing a drip irrigation system, and carefully selecting perennial plants that would survive North Carolina winters and come back strong each spring. My wife died 4 years ago, and this garden had become my therapy, my purpose, my way of keeping connected to something living and beautiful. Sarah had always wanted a proper garden, and I built this one in her memory. The garden included heirloom roses that I had grafted myself, lavender plants descended from cuttings we brought back from a trip to France, Japanese maples that I had carefully trained and pruned, and a collection of herbs that would make any chef jealous. The centerpiece was a small koi pond I had built, surrounded by hostas and ferns. Everything was designed to be low maintenance but spectacular, and it was the envy of the neighborhood. People would walk by specifically to look at it. Patricia Henderson had other ideas about what my property should look like. It started in November when she sent me a letter stating that my garden gnome was not in compliance with HOA aesthetic standards. The gnome was 8 inches tall and tucked behind a rosemary bush. You could barely see it from the street. I removed it anyway because I did not want trouble. Then she complained about the height of my ornamental grasses. According to her interpretation of the HOA rules, no plant could exceed 36 inches in height in front yards. Never mind that half the neighborhood had Bradford pears and dogwoods that were 20 feet tall. She meant ornamental plants, she said. I trimmed the grasses. In early December, she left a notice on my door about the unapproved stone border around my garden beds. This was particularly ridiculous because the stones had been there when I bought the house, installed by the previous owner who had been an HOA board member. I provided documentation of this, including photos from the original listing. She backed down but made it clear she was not happy about it. Then winter came, and I prepared my garden the way I always did. I mulched the beds heavily, wrapped the more delicate Japanese maples in burlap, drained and covered the pond, and made sure everything was protected. North Carolina winters are generally mild, but we do get cold snaps and the occasional snow, so protection is important for some plants. On December 15th, I left for Oregon to spend 3 weeks with my daughter Amanda and her family. It was the first Christmas since Sarah passed that I felt ready to be around family and try to enjoy the holidays. Amanda had been asking me to visit for months, and I finally agreed. The morning I left, I did a final check of the garden. Everything looked perfect. The mulch was in place, the burlap was secure, and I had asked my neighbor Tom to check on the house while I was gone. Tom lived 2 doors down and was a retired engineer who spent most of his time in his garage workshop. He was a good guy, and I trusted him. I flew out that afternoon and spent 3 wonderful weeks with my daughter, son-in-law Marcus, and my 2 grandchildren. We baked cookies, watched movies, and I even felt myself laughing again. It was the best I had felt in years. Tom called me on December 28th. "Oscar, I think you need to see something," he said. His voice was strange, careful. "What is going on?" I asked. "It is your garden. Something is not right. I did not want to worry you during the holidays, but I think you should know before you get back." "What do you mean something is not right?" The plants look sick. Really sick, all of them. My stomach dropped. "What kind of sick?" "I do not know how to describe it. Brown, wilting, like they are dying." "But it is winter, so I thought maybe it was just the cold. But then I remembered you always say your perennials go dormant. They do not die back like this." "Is it all of them?" "Everything I can see, yeah. The roses, the Japanese maples, even the grass in the beds. It is all turning brown and crispy." I felt panic rising. "Tom, can you take some pictures and send them to me?" "Already did. Check your email." I opened my laptop right there in Amanda's living room and pulled up the photos. What I saw made my heart stop. The lush green perennials that should have been dormant but healthy were brown and desiccated. The Japanese maples looked like they had been scorched. Even the winter hardy herbs that should have been fine were completely dead. "Oscar?" Tom's voice came through the phone. "You still there?" "Yeah, I am here." "Tom, this does not make sense. These plants are cold hardy. This looks like chemical damage." "That is what I was thinking too, but who would do that?" I did not answer because I already had a suspicion, but I needed to see it in person before I made any accusations. I flew home 2 days earlier than planned on December 30th. The moment I walked into my front yard, I felt sick. The photos had not done justice to the destruction. Everything was dead or dying. 3 years of work, countless hours, hundreds of plants, all destroyed. I knelt in one of the raised beds and pulled back the mulch. The soil underneath had a strange white crust on it. I touched it and brought my fingers to my nose. Salt. The soil smelled like salt. Someone had salted my garden. I stood up and looked around the neighborhood. A few houses down, I could see Patricia Henderson standing in her driveway, watching me. When she saw me looking, she turned and went inside. Tom came over within minutes of seeing my truck in the driveway. "It is worse in person, right?" he said. "Tom, did you see anyone in my yard while I was gone?" He hesitated. "I saw Patricia here a couple of times, but she is the HOA president, so I figured she was doing inspections or something. She has been doing a lot of those lately." "When did you see her?" 3 or 4 times, actually. "Once about a week after you left, then again a few days before Christmas, and then once more right after Christmas. Each time she was here for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. Did you see what she was doing?" "Not really." "She was walking around the garden. I figured she was checking for violations." "You know how she is." I knew exactly how she was. I spent the rest of that day taking detailed photographs of everything. I documented the dead plants, the salt crust on the soil, the pattern of destruction. Everything in the garden beds was dead, but the grass in the lawn, just inches away, was fine. This was not a natural die-off. This was targeted. That evening I called a soil testing lab and arranged for someone to come out and take samples. I wanted documentation that the soil had been contaminated with salt before I made any official complaints. The lab technician came out on January 2nd. Her name was Rita, and she was a middle-aged woman with 20 years of experience in agricultural testing. "This is salt damage," she said immediately upon examining the soil. "I can tell before we even run tests. See this white crystalline residue? That is salt buildup, and the smell is distinctive too." "How much salt would it take to do this kind of damage?" I asked. "A lot. This was not accidental. Someone would have had to apply pounds and pounds of salt to beds this size to kill everything like this. Probably rock salt or water softener salt, something cheap and easy to spread." Can you test for the concentration and give me an official report? Absolutely. I will take samples from multiple locations in the beds and from your lawn for comparison. You will have a full report within a week. True to her word, the report arrived on January 8th. The salt concentration in my garden beds was off the charts, measuring over 8,000 parts per million in some areas. Normal soil should have less than 200 parts per million. The lawn, by comparison, measured normal levels. The report concluded that large quantities of salt had been deliberately introduced to the garden beds, causing fatal damage to all plant life and rendering the soil unsuitable for growing anything for the foreseeable future. Armed with this report, I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, requesting that they review security footage if any existed and investigate the matter. I also sent a certified letter to Patricia Henderson directly, stating that I had evidence suggesting my garden had been intentionally destroyed, and that I would be pursuing legal action against the responsible party. Patricia's response arrived 3 days later. It was a masterpiece of deflection and gaslighting. The letter stated that she had conducted multiple inspections of my property in December and had found numerous violations, including excessive mulch application, improperly secured plant coverings, and failure to maintain aesthetic standards. She claimed that any damage to my garden was the result of my own negligence in preparing the plants for winter. She made no mention of the salt, the lab report, or my accusations. She also included a list of fines totaling $800 for various supposed violations, and gave me 30 days to remove all dead and dying plant material from the property or face additional fines. I was furious, but I tried to stay calm. I responded with a letter from my attorney, a guy named Jeff Morrison who specialized in property law. Jeff drafted a letter explaining that I had documented evidence of deliberate destruction of property, that the HOA had no jurisdiction to fine me for damage caused by criminal activity, and that if the matter was not resolved, we would be filing a civil suit and a police report. That seemed to quiet things down for a few weeks. Patricia stopped sending letters, and I spent January and February dealing with the aftermath of the destruction. I had to remove all the dead plants, which was heartbreaking. The Japanese maples that I had trained for 3 years, the roses I had grafted, the lavender from France, all of it went into the compost bin or the trash. Some of the smaller perennials I held onto, hoping maybe the roots had survived, but deep down I knew they were gone. The soil was the biggest problem. According to Rita and several other experts I consulted, soil with that level of salt contamination would take years to recover naturally. I could speed up the process by removing the top 12 inches of soil and replacing it entirely, but that would be expensive and labor-intensive. For 6 raised beds in the pond area, I was looking at removing and disposing of approximately 15 cubic yards of contaminated soil and bringing in the same amount of new soil. The quotes I got ranged from $3,000 to $5,000 just for the soil work. I documented all of this. Every quote, every hour of labor, every dead plant with its original purchase price. I was building a case, but I had a problem. I had proof that the soil was salted. I had documentation that Patricia had been on my property multiple times while I was gone, and I had Tom as a witness who saw her in my yard. What I did not have was direct proof that Patricia was the one who applied the salt. Tom had not seen her actually spreading salt, just walking around the garden. My attorney advised me to file a police report for destruction of property. I did that in mid-February. The Raleigh Police Department sent an officer to take my statement and look at the evidence. Officer Ramirez was professional and took detailed notes, but I could tell he was skeptical about whether this would go anywhere. "The problem is proving who did it," he said. "You have circumstantial evidence, but no direct proof. No security footage, no witnesses who actually saw the act, no confession. It is tough to prosecute something like this. What about the fact that she was on my property multiple times without permission?" "That is trespassing, technically, but as HOA president, she might argue she had the right to inspect the property. You would need to prove she was there with criminal intent." "So what do I do?" "Keep documenting everything. If she does anything else, let us know immediately. Sometimes people like this get overconfident and make mistakes. In the meantime, I will file the report and we will keep it on record. If more evidence comes to light, we can pursue charges." It was not the answer I wanted, but it was what I had to work with. February turned into March, and I watched the neighborhood come back to life around me. Daffodils bloomed in yards up and down the street. Trees budded. Gardens that had been dormant all winter started showing signs of spring. My yard remained dead, a brown patch of dirt where there should have been color and life. Patricia sent me another letter in early March reminding me about the fines and threatening to put a lien on my property if I did not pay. My attorney responded again, and the threats stopped. Then in mid-March, something unexpected happened. Tom called me on a Saturday afternoon. "Oscar, you need to get over here right now." "What is going on?" "Just come over. Bring your camera." I grabbed my phone and walked over to Tom's house. He was standing in his driveway, looking at his flower beds, which were along the side of his house. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a section of flowers that had been beautiful purple and yellow pansies the week before. Now they were brown and dead. I knelt down and examined the soil. White crystalline residue, the distinctive smell. "Tom, your soil has been salted." "I know, and I know who did it because I have her on camera." My heart started racing. "You have security cameras, installed them 2 months ago. My daughter bought them for me for Christmas." "They are those wireless ones that record to the cloud. I put one facing the driveway and one facing the backyard." "Please tell me you caught something." Tom pulled out his phone and opened an app. "Better than that. I caught her red-handed." He played a video from 4 nights earlier. The timestamp showed 2:30 in the morning. In the grainy night vision footage, I could clearly see Patricia Henderson walking into Tom's side yard carrying what looked like a large bag. She spent several minutes spreading something from the bag onto the flower beds, then left. "I can send this to you and to the police," Tom said. "This is deliberate destruction of property caught on camera." "Tom, this is exactly what we needed. Do you think she might be on camera in my yard too?" "I do not know. The angle does not really cover your property." "But this proves she is doing it." "Why would she salt your garden, though? Has she been hassling you?" "She sent me a letter last month about my mailbox being the wrong color. I told her to pound sand. I guess this is her revenge." I called Officer Ramirez immediately. He came out that afternoon to view the footage and take a new report. This time he was much more interested. "This is good evidence," he said. "This shows her deliberately destroying property. Combined with your case and the similar method, we have a pattern. I am going to talk to the detective division about this." "Can you arrest her?" Tom asked. "We need to build the case first, but yes, this could lead to charges. Destruction of property, possibly trespassing, and if we can prove she did it to multiple properties, that shows a pattern of behavior that makes the case stronger." "What should we do in the meantime?" I asked. "Install cameras if you have not already. She might strike again, and if she does, we want to catch her. Also, I am going to need copies of all your documentation, the soil reports, the photos, the quotes for repairs, everything." Over the next week, I installed 4 security cameras around my property, covering all approaches to the front and backyards. I also reached out to other neighbors to see if anyone else had experienced similar problems. That is when things got interesting. A neighbor 3 streets over named Julie contacted me after hearing through the neighborhood gossip network about what was happening. She said her vegetable garden had mysteriously died last fall, right after she had gotten into a dispute with Patricia about a fence height. At the time, Julie thought it was just bad luck or disease, but now she was wondering if it had been intentional. Then another neighbor, Robert, who lived on the next street, told me his rose bushes had all died over the winter after he refused to remove a small fountain from his front yard that Patricia claimed was too ostentatious. I put Julie and Robert in touch with Officer Ramirez and my attorney. Both of them had their soil tested, and both came back with high salt content. We now had 4 properties that had been damaged, all following disputes with Patricia Henderson. The detective division assigned an investigator named Detective Lisa Brennan to the case. She was in her 40s, sharp, and took the case seriously from the start. What we have here is someone using their position in the HOA to harass and punish residents who do not comply with her demands. Detective Brennan said in a meeting with me, Tom, Julie, and Robert in late March. The problem is, until we caught her on video at Tom's house, everything was circumstantial. Now we have direct evidence of one incident and a clear pattern. I am going to seek a warrant for her arrest. What charges? I asked. Multiple counts of destruction of property, trespassing, and possibly abuse of authority. The property destruction charges alone, given the value of what was destroyed, could be prosecuted as misdemeanors or even low-level felonies. When you add up all 4 properties, we are looking at tens of thousands of dollars in damages. How long until she is arrested? Julie asked. I am presenting the evidence to the district attorney's office tomorrow. If they approve, which I think they will, we will execute the warrant within a few days. It happened on April 1st, which felt appropriate. Patricia Henderson was arrested at her home at 8 in the morning. She was charged with 4 counts of destruction of property and 4 counts of criminal trespass. Bond was set at $10,000. The neighborhood exploded with gossip. Some people defended Patricia, saying we were overreacting and that there was no proof she had done anything. Others, including many who had been on the receiving end of her harassment, were thrilled to see her finally face consequences. The HOA held an emergency meeting the following week to discuss the situation. Patricia was suspended from her position as president pending the outcome of the criminal case. A new interim president, a reasonable guy named Mike Stevenson, was appointed. But here is where my story takes an unexpected turn, the one that proved everything. In mid-April, as spring really took hold and the weather warmed up, I noticed something strange in my dead garden beds. Small green shoots were pushing up through the soil in several locations. At first, I thought it was just weeds taking advantage of the empty space. But as I looked closer, I realized these were not weeds. These were plants I recognized. Some of my perennials were coming back. I called Rita from the soil testing lab. That does not make sense, she said when I described what was happening. With salt levels that high, nothing should be growing. Are you sure these are not just opportunistic weeds? I am sure. I can identify my lavender plants, and this looks like maybe some of the sedum too. Can I send you pictures? Please do. And I should come out and retest the soil. Something is not adding up. Rita came out 3 days later and took new soil samples from the areas where plants were emerging. The results came back showing salt levels had dropped dramatically. Some areas were down to less than 1,000 parts per million, which was still elevated but no longer toxic to plants. "This is really unusual," Rita said. "Salt does not dissipate from soil this quickly unless there has been massive water flushing. Have you been irrigating heavily?" "No, just normal spring rain." "We have had more rain than usual this spring, but still, this level of reduction in 4 months is extraordinary. Unless..." "Unless what?" "Unless the salt was only applied to the surface and did not penetrate deep into the soil. If it was just spread on top of the beds and not worked in, then heavy winter and spring rain could have flushed it down below the root zone or even out of the beds entirely." "Your beds are raised, right?" "Yes, about 8 inches above grade. So water drains through them pretty efficiently. If the salt was just dumped on top, it might have washed through. The plants with deeper root systems that were protected below the salt layer could have survived." This was huge. This meant that some of my plants might actually survive, and it also told us something about how Patricia had applied the salt. She had dumped it on top of the beds, probably spreading it around with her hands or a small shovel, but had not worked it deep into the soil. She had not wanted to disturb the mulch too much and make it obvious what she was doing. Over the next 2 weeks, more and more plants emerged. Some of my sedums came back. A few of the more resilient herbs like oregano and thyme pushed up new growth. Most dramatically, one of my Japanese maples, which had looked completely dead, started budding out from the base. The top growth was dead, but the roots had survived. It was not everything. The roses were gone. The lavender, which I had treasured most, was dead. Many of the perennials that had been my favorites did not return. But enough survived that it was clear the garden could recover. I documented all of this with photos and dates. Every new shoot, every plant that returned, I recorded it all. Patricia's trial was scheduled for July. My attorney, Jeff, was coordinating with the district attorney's office to make sure they had all our documentation and evidence. The case against Patricia was strong. They had video of her salting Tom's garden. They had soil reports from 4 properties showing intentional salt contamination. They had testimony from multiple witnesses who had seen her on properties without permission. And they had the pattern of the attacks, all following disputes with her. Patricia's defense attorney tried to argue that she was just conducting legitimate HOA inspections, and that the salt contamination could have been from road salt runoff or other sources. But the evidence was overwhelming. The salt concentrations were far too high to be from runoff. The pattern was too consistent, and the video from Tom's camera was damning. During the discovery phase, something else came to light. Patricia had purchased over 300 pounds of rock salt from a hardware store in December, paid with her credit card. The purchase was on December 17th, 2 days after I left for Oregon. When investigators checked, no rock salt had been applied to HOA common areas that winter, and Patricia had no legitimate reason to have purchased that much salt. The trial lasted 3 days in mid-July. I testified about my garden, the damage, and the impact it had on me. I talked about how the garden was my connection to my late wife, how 3 years of work had been destroyed, and how I had watched the neighborhood bloom around me while my yard remained dead. Tom testified about catching Patricia on camera and about his own damaged garden. Julie and Robert testified about their experiences. Rita testified about the soil contamination and how it had to have been deliberate. The defense put up a weak case, mostly trying to suggest that there were other possible explanations for the damage and that Patricia was being persecuted for doing her job as HOA president. But they could not explain the video, the salt purchase, or the consistent pattern. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Patricia Henderson guilty on all counts, Sentencing was scheduled for August 15th. The district attorney asked for jail time, arguing that Patricia had abused her position of authority and had systematically harassed and damaged the property of multiple homeowners. The defense asked for probation and community service. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Judge Catherine Morrison, was clearly not sympathetic to Patricia. "Mrs. Henderson," she said at sentencing, "you were in a position of trust within your community. Homeowners associations exist to maintain and improve neighborhoods, not to serve as vehicles for personal vendettas. You systematically targeted residents who disagreed with you and caused thousands of dollars in damage to their property. You destroyed gardens that represented years of work and, in Mr. Vaughn's case, a memorial to his late wife. Your actions show a callous disregard for others and an abuse of the authority you were given." Judge Morrison sentenced Patricia to 90 days in jail, 3 years of probation, and ordered her to pay full restitution to all 4 victims. In my case, that meant Patricia owed me $8,000 to cover the cost of the soil remediation, plant replacement, and my time spent on repairs. Tom, Julie, and Robert received similar judgments. Patricia also had to resign permanently from the HOA board and was prohibited from serving in any HOA leadership position in the future. As I sat in that courtroom and watched Patricia being led away, I felt a mix of emotions. Satisfaction, certainly. Justice had been served. But also sadness that it had come to this, that someone could be so petty and vindictive over something as harmless as a garden. The aftermath of the trial brought unexpected changes to Meadowbrook Estates. The HOA board, now under Mike Stevenson's leadership, conducted a comprehensive review of all the rules and procedures. They discovered that Patricia had been selectively enforcing rules, targeting people she did not like while ignoring violations by her friends. They found she had created interpretations of rules that did not exist in the actual governing documents. They even found that some of the fines she had levied were not authorized by the HOA bylaws. Mike called a community meeting in September to address all of this. Over 100 residents showed up, which was unprecedented. Most HOA meetings drew maybe 10 people. "We have a lot of work to do to restore trust in this organization," Mike said. Patricia Henderson's actions were not reflective of what an HOA should be. "We are here to maintain property values and ensure everyone can enjoy their homes, not to micromanage every detail of your lives." He announced a series of reforms. All rule enforcement would now require approval from at least 2 board members, not just the president. Homeowners would have a clear appeals process for any fines or violations. And most importantly, the board would focus on serious issues like property maintenance and safety, rather than minor aesthetic complaints. As for my garden, the recovery was slower than I hoped but more complete than I feared. By September, about 30% of my original plants had returned. The Japanese maple that budded from the base was growing vigorously, and I was training the new shoots to replace the dead top growth. The sedums and some of the other hardy perennials filled in the spaces where other plants had died. I used part of the restitution money from Patricia to buy new plants, but I was more selective this time. I chose native plants that were tough and resilient, things that could survive neglect, drought, and yes, even salt contamination. I added new varieties too, things I had always wanted to try. The garden was different from what it had been, but in some ways it was better. It had a story now, a history of survival and recovery. The lavender from France was gone forever, and that hurt. Those cuttings had been irreplaceable, a physical connection to a trip Sarah and I had taken for our 20th anniversary. But I planted new lavender American varieties that were hardy to our zone, and while they were not the same, they still bloomed purple and smelled sweet. Tom became a good friend through all of this. We started having coffee together on Saturday mornings, talking about our gardens and trading cuttings. His pansies recovered quickly, and he expanded his flower beds, adding more variety. He told me the security cameras had been the best gift his daughter ever gave him, not because they caught Patricia, but because they gave him peace of mind. Julie and Robert both recovered their gardens as well. Julie's vegetable garden was producing again by midsummer, though she had to replace all the soil in her raised beds. Robert planted new roses, different varieties from what he had before, and they were thriving. The four of us formed an informal gardening club, meeting once a month to share tips and just enjoy each other's company. It was one of the few good things that came from the whole ordeal. Patricia served her 90 days in jail starting in September. When she was released just before Christmas, she and her husband put their house up for sale. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that they were moving to a condo in Florida where there was no HOA, which seemed ironic. They moved out in February, and I never saw her again. A young couple with a baby bought their house in March. Their names were Tim and Alina, and they were excited to be first-time homeowners. Alina mentioned to me that they were thinking about starting a garden and asked if I had any advice. I spent an afternoon helping them plan their flower beds, showing them what worked well in our climate and what to avoid. I gave them cuttings from my oregano and thyme, divisions of some of my recovered sedums, and advice on soil preparation. The most important thing, I told Alina as we knelt in her future garden bed, is to grow what you love. Do not let anyone tell you what your garden should be. It is your space, your piece of earth. Make it yours. She smiled and thanked me, and I could see the excitement in her eyes, the same excitement I had felt when I first started my garden years ago. By the spring of the second year after the incident, my garden was about 70% recovered. Some sections were still in progress, but others were more beautiful than they had ever been. I had learned which plants were truly tough, which ones could survive anything, and I had gained an appreciation for resilience in both plants and people. The Japanese maple that had survived from the roots was now 3 feet tall, its new growth reaching toward the sun. I stood looking at it one morning in April, exactly 2 years after I had first noticed the new growth emerging from my supposedly dead garden. That maple was my favorite plant now, more than any of the original ones had been. It represented something important. It had been damaged, nearly destroyed, but its roots had been strong enough to survive. It had endured the winter, the salt, the death of everything around it, and when conditions improved, it had fought back. It had grown new shoots, reached for the light, and thrived. I had a small plaque made and placed it near the maple. It read, "In memory of Sarah Vaughn, a garden of resilience." Tom came over that evening with a bottle of wine to celebrate the 2-year anniversary of what he called the Great Garden Resurrection. "You know," he said as we sat in my backyard, looking at the garden in the golden evening light, "I have been thinking about what Patricia said during the trial. She claimed she was just trying to maintain standards, that she was protecting property values." Yeah, I remember. What about it? It made me realize how twisted people can get when they have a little bit of power. She genuinely believed she was in the right. She thought enforcing her vision of what the neighborhood should look like was more important than people's happiness or their property. That is scary. It is, I agreed. But I think the scarier thing is how many people go along with it. How many neighbors did not speak up when they saw what she was doing because they did not want to be her next target? "Guilty as charged," Tom said quietly. I saw her harassing you and I did not say anything at first. I told myself it was not my business. But you did speak up eventually. You came forward with the video evidence. That took courage. Only after she came after me too. I should have done it sooner. We sat in silence for a moment, watching the sky turn pink and orange. You know what I learned from all this? I said finally. Community matters. Real community. Not the fake kind that HOAs pretend to create with their rules and regulations. Real community is people looking out for each other, helping each other, and standing up when someone is being wronged. That is what you did, what Julie and Robert did. That is what made the difference. Tom raised his glass. To real community, then, and to gardens that refuse to die. To resilience, I added, and we drank. The lawsuit I filed against Patricia, separate from the criminal restitution, was settled out of court in May. Her homeowner's insurance paid an additional $12,000 to cover the full value of the rare plants I had lost, the emotional distress, and punitive damages. It was more than I had expected, but Jeff had argued persuasively that the destruction of Sarah's memorial garden constituted intentional infliction of emotional distress, and the insurance company did not want to go to trial. I used some of that money to create a small scholarship in Sarah's name at the local community college for students studying horticulture. It seemed like a fitting tribute, helping the next generation of gardeners. The rest, I invested back into the garden and into helping my new gardening club friends. We chipped in together to buy a small greenhouse that we set up in Tom's backyard, where we could propagate plants and start seeds for all our gardens. It became a social hub, a place where we gathered to work and talk and simply enjoy each other's company. The Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, under Mike's leadership, became something different. Mike focused on the basics, maintaining common areas, enforcing reasonable rules about property maintenance, and organizing community events. He started a neighborhood garden tour in the spring where people could show off their gardens if they wanted to. The first year, 8 families participated. The second year, it was 20. My garden was on the tour both years. People would stop and ask about the plants, and I would tell them the story. Not just about Patricia and the salt, but about Sarah, about loss and recovery, about learning to grow again after devastation. Some people cried. Many people thanked me for sharing. One woman, around my age, stopped by during the second year's tour. Her name was Claire Vega, and she had just moved to Raleigh after her husband passed away. She was thinking about starting a garden, she said, as a way to cope with her grief. I do not know where to start, she admitted. I have never gardened before. I spent an hour with her that day, talking about plants and soil and the simple peace that comes from working with living things. I gave her some cuttings to start her own garden, the same ones I had given Alina, the ones that had survived everything. Claire came back the following week with questions, and then the next week with pictures of her new garden bed. She joined our gardening club, and over the summer we spent a lot of time together, working in our gardens and talking about life. By fall, Claire and I were having dinner together regularly. By Christmas, we were dating. It was not a betrayal of Sarah's memory, I realized. It was an acceptance that life continues, that gardens grow again, that spring always comes after winter. Sarah would have liked Claire. They both had the same laugh, the same way of finding joy in small things. And Claire loved the garden, understood what it meant to me, and never tried to change it or make it something it was not. On a warm evening in late May, 3 years after the salt incident, I was working in the garden with Claire. We were planting a new rose bush, a variety called New Dawn that was supposed to be nearly indestructible. As we worked together, patting soil around the roots and watering it in, I felt something I had not felt in years. Complete peace. The garden was not perfect. Some sections were still recovering. Some plants I had loved were gone forever. But it was alive, it was beautiful, and it was mine. No one could take that away. Tom walked over with Alina and her now toddler son, who loved to chase butterflies in the garden. Julie and Robert showed up too, carrying a potted plant they had propagated from cuttings I had given them months before. "We thought your garden needed this," Julie said, handing me the pot. It was one of my original sedums, one that I had shared with her after mine recovered. She had grown it on and was now giving me back a piece of what I had lost. I felt my eyes water as I took the plant. "Thank you. This means more than you know." We planted it together, all of us working in the garden, talking and laughing. Alina's son toddled around, pointing at flowers and butterflies. Claire took pictures with her phone. Tom told a joke that was not funny but made us all laugh anyway. This was what community was supposed to be. Not rules and regulations and fines. Not someone telling you your garden gnome was too visible or your grass was a quarter-inch too tall. Just people, caring about each other, helping each other grow. As the sun set that evening and everyone headed home, I stood alone in my garden for a few minutes. The Japanese maple that had survived from the roots was now 5 feet tall, its branches spreading wide. The sedums were in bloom, their pink flowers attracting bees. The new rose bush looked healthy and strong in its freshly dug hole. I thought about the journey I had been on. The loss of Sarah. The destruction of the garden. The anger and frustration of dealing with Patricia. The slow, patient work of recovery. The unexpected friendships. The even more unexpected love. It had all been worth it. Not because I had won some battle or gotten revenge, but because I had learned that resilience is not about being so strong that nothing can hurt you. It is about having roots deep enough to survive when everything above ground is destroyed. It is about the patience to wait for spring. It is about believing that growth is possible even when everything looks dead. The garden had taught me that. The salt had not killed everything, just the parts above ground. The roots, the essential core, had survived. And when the salt washed away and conditions improved, life returned. The same was true for people, I realized. We all have roots deeper than we know. Grief, loss, betrayal, they can burn away everything we thought we were. But if our roots are strong, if we have faith and patience and people who care about us, we can grow again. Different than before, maybe. Changed. But alive and reaching for the sun. I walked into my house that night feeling grateful. Grateful for my daughter who had given me a place to escape to when I needed it. Grateful for Tom who had the courage to speak up. Grateful for Julie and Robert who had stood with me. Grateful for the justice system that had worked, slowly but surely. Grateful for Rita who had provided the scientific evidence we needed. Grateful for Mike who had reformed the HOA into something positive. Grateful for Alina and Tim and all the new neighbors who were making the community better. And grateful for Claire who had appeared in my life like a spring flower, unexpected and beautiful. Most of all, I was grateful for my garden. For the Japanese maple that refused to die. For the sedums that came back stronger. For the new plants that were thriving. For the soil that had healed itself with time and rain. Patricia Henderson had tried to destroy something I loved. She had very nearly succeeded. But in failing, she had taught me something valuable about resilience, community, and the patient inevitability of spring. My garden was not the same as it had been before the salt. It was better. It had a story. It had survived. And it would continue to grow season after season, year after year, a living testament to the simple truth that life finds a way. The salt had not won. Spring had proved it.